Good afternoon. So, in continuation with the previous lecture, I welcome you again to the e-commerce lecture series that we are taking up. So, in the last lecture, we were talking about the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web and how the World Wide Web functions. Now, we will look at a few components of the World Wide Web, because when we are talking about the e-commerce, we will commonly talk about these terms. So, it is very important for us to understand what each of these terms means actually. So, first of these terms that we use is the client and the server. Now, client here would actually mean a web client and a web server, right. So, what is a web client? A client is that computer or that device which is requesting for a service from another computer. So, the computer which requests for a service or for some information is the client, and that gives the service or the information is known as the web server, right. So, when you are actually accessing, say you open a web browser. Now, what is a browser? A browser is any program, any application on the user's computer with which you access the internet, like for example your Internet Explorer or your Google Chrome or your Apple Safari. All these are known as browsers, right. So, when you are accessing the World Wide Web or you are trying to open any website through your browser, you are actually the client, and the server is the computer where that particular website has been hosted. Say for example, you say on your on your web browser you write www. say for example du.ac.in, right. So, du.ac.in is the URL of the server which you want to open, and what you are accessing it. So, you are the client and the server is going to be the website whose address you are giving in your address bar. Then of course you have the search engines. So, search engines, we all know, these are used to search the relevant information over the internet. So, in connection to the search engine, we often talk about programs called the spiders or the crawlers. Now, what are these? Basically, these are automated programs which run on, and they keep on scanning all the web pages and they keep updating the databases or the lists of the search engines, right. So, they have a complete profile, or they have, you can say, a complete directory of all the web pages which are live, which are active based on certain keywords, etc. So, when we type anything in the search engine, it looks at the directory, and how is the directory updated? It is through the use of the spider. So, the spider is a program which constantly crawls the web pages. It constantly keeps scanning all the web pages on the World Wide Web and updating the search engine. Then of course, web page and website I have already discussed. Web page is a single document which is created, a single HTML file. Website is a collection of different web pages. Internet service providers are the companies which provide internet services to us, through which we get the internet connection. So, our internet connection, we could have a mobile data connection. So, then it will be the mobile service provider who is becoming our internet service provider, or we can have dedicated internet service providers also who only provide a dedicated line of internet to us. So, internet service providers are basically those companies or those individuals who provide internet connection to the individuals, right. Then website hosting services are there. Now, what does hosting mean? Hosting basically means that when you create your website, you have to host it on a particular server through which the clients can access your website, right. So, how do you access the servers? So, there are particular companies, or you can say there are particular agencies which provide you this kind of hosting services. So, you have to pay them, the person who, or the individual who wants to host the website, they have to pay some amount of money for the services that the hosting agency is providing to them. Then we have the domain names, the URL and the IP. So internet service providers we've already discussed. So domain name and registers we will be take up in the due course, and HTML I have already discussed. HTML is the tool for creating web pages. So HTML is a very specific, very peculiar type of tool, or you can say it's a language also, with which you create the front end of your the web pages. This is the client server architecture that we talk about. So when you are talking about the internet, so this cloud here represents the internet, right? So the client sends an HTTP request. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, right? So this is the protocol, or this is the set of rules which will govern how communication will take place over the internet in terms of World Wide Web. Right, so the client will send an HTTP request to a server. The server will process that request and send back an HTTP response to the client. And all this request response communication to and fro is happening through the internet. So the internet is providing this kind of communication facility. So this is how the client server architecture is working, is laid down in case of internet. So we already discussed that internet service providers, they basically connect the clients to the internet. So these could be phone companies, or they could be any kind of cable or satellite or dial-up or any kind of connection which the basic internet service is providing. So when you're talking about the hosting services, so they connect the website to the internet. So when you are hosting, you have these server farms. They are called as the server farms, where your website can be hosted. There is particular software which is deployed. So web servers are actually very specific computers which have got they are high end computers which have got very good robust hardware architecture, and they also have very different kind of software configuration to process that kind of the processes. So there can be web server software like like one example could be Apache, right? So Apache is a server software which is used on a large number of web servers. Then besides the hardware and software, the firewall is an important component of a web server. Firewall will protect the web server from any kind of malicious software, right? So and these are the other networking devices, like you have the routers and you have the switches, you have the requisite storage space, you have the required amount of disk space. All these are there, and of course you have an email server also on your web server. Most of the e-commerce websites, they have this email facility also, which we will be talking about later. So next is the URL. So URL, as I told you, it's a uniform resource locator, right? So in URL, you can see here, these are the different parts of the URL. The first part is the protocol, like where it is written HTTP, that is the protocol. So protocol basically means the rules or the methods with which communication will happen, right? So when we talk about HTTP, because it is World Wide Web, in hypertext information is being transferred, so it is known as the HTTP protocol, right? So protocol basically you can say something like a language. Okay, say for example, when two individuals want to communicate with each other, right? So two persons want to communicate with each other, so they need to understand the same language, only then they can communicate. They need to agree on the same set of languages when they are communicating, right? So if either of them does not understand any language the other person is speaking, they cannot communicate. Similarly, you can understand protocols also, that when two computers are communicating with each other, then the protocols will define how the communication is going to happen. So both the computers must agree, must abide by the same set of protocols, only then communication can take place. So the first part of the URL specifies what is the protocol according to which the data will be shared or the communication will take place. The second part you can see is www, of course that stands for World Wide Web, and then you have the domain name. Domain name is basically the name or the identity which you give to your website. Then you have the port, Sometimes this is not shown, but this is the point or this is the socket where the connection will happen. So generally when we talk about HTTP, it is on the port 80 that the communication will happen, and then finally you give the complete directory and the resource path, that is the complete path of the file on the server. So when we are talking about the URL, we talk about all these different things. Now what are domain names? Basically you can break the domain name into different levels. Okay, so for example, if we take an example of www.someaddress.com, right? This is a hypothetical domain name which we are taking. So here .com is the top level domain name, right? The second level domain name is the some address, and the third level domain name is the World Wide Web. So .com basically tells you the type, or the top level domain name tells you the type of website the page belongs to, right? So there can be different types of domain names. So you can have, .com or .org or .nic or .ac.in. So that depends. So if you are ac.in, it means it's an academic institution of India, right? If you say .gov.in, it means it's a government institution of India, right? So like this you can have domain names, and there can be hierarchy also. So actually what happens, how this domain name thing functions is that computers on a network, every computer on a network has a unique address, right? And that address is known as the Internet Protocol address or the IP address, right? So it is something like 255.255. So it's in the quadrant, it's 4 numbers in the range of 0 to 255 if we are talking about IP4 addresses, right? But it is very difficult to identify or to remember these numbers. So the easier thing is to give a name, or to identify the number, or to associate the number with a name. So therefore this series of domain name servers is maintained, which is actually creating, or which is actually keeping a list, or there is a mapping of domain names to IP addresses, which is done by the domain name server. So when we type the domain name, say for example if we type the domain name www.google.com, so internally it is not it is not processed as google.com, but it is processed as the IP address of Google. So it will be mapped on by the domain name server, and it will be converted into a number which is known as the IP address. So this stands true for all websites. Okay, so when we have our e-commerce website also, which is hosted on a particular server, so we will be getting the IP address of our server, and we will also know that this is the domain name of my website. So domain name has to be registered, so there is a registering company, so which is a company which provides domain name registration services, and they charge a fee for this, right? So they also help you maintain this map of domain name to Internet Protocol addresses. So whenever you want to register, whenever you want to start your own website, whenever you want to create your own website, and you have to choose a domain name, so you have to go to these registrar companies who will register your domain name. So just like companies are registered, similarly domain names are registered, and there cannot be two websites in the world which have exactly the same domain name, right? So this is also unique. Just like registered company names are unique, the domain names are registered are also unique. So you can consider a domain name registration once your website has been registered. Once your website has been created, you look for a domain name, and then you look for a hosting service. So these are the simple steps which are involved while you are creating your new website. So what do? The first thing that you do is that you choose a domain name. What is going to be your domain name, right? When you are talking about e-business, there are certain considerations to be kept in mind before you choose a particular domain name. So we will be talking about that segment later. Okay, so after you have chosen a domain name, then the next step is to register with a registrar the company or the agency which will register your domain name. Then you choose a hosting service, right? Which company will you use, or which agency or which server you want to host your website onto. Then you tell the registrar the IP address of your hosting company or your hosting server. Every hosting server will have an IP address. So once you have registered, once you have paid the hosting fees, they will give you the IP address which you have to communicate with your registrar. Right, after this is done, after this activity is completed, then you actually go on creating the content. So then you start creating the web pages, right, and then you store and you publish those web pages on your hosting server. So first you create the pages, of course, on the local computers. Once your website is ready, it has been tested, then you create and then you publish it, or then you know what we say is you import it or export it onto the web server, right? And then once your website is active, it's live, it's running, then you have to submit it to the search engines. You make sure that the search engines get to know through your keywords, through your images, through the meta information which you are providing in your HTML tags, HTML pages, that the website now exists and it is registered and it is shown in search engine result pages when anybody searches for that kind of information. So this was, you know, a basic understanding of how the internet functions, how websites are created, and what are the steps involved in getting a website running, because this is the key of your website, is the key to building an e-commerce business, right? In a physical business, it's your physical shop, but in a e-business or in an e-commerce venture, your website is your interface to the outside world, to the market, to the consumer. So it's very important that you understand the nuances, the terms, and the process of how a website is created. So multiple, you know, tools are used for creating websites these days. So you have HTML, you have DHTML, right? Then you have the CSS, scripting languages, and web creation and editing softwares are there. So there are lectures, you know, which are available on CEC, which covers each of these segments also. If you are interested in knowing about these in detail, you can go and watch those lectures as well. So of course, we've already discussed this, that what is page and what is a site, right? So page is, as I said, it's a single HTML file and it has got all information which is related to a single theme, right? So it's very small in size. You know, if you look at the physical size, it will be very small, right? It will be few KB or max to max a few MB, right? And there is a layout which is done, right? But when you talk about sites, they have, of course, multiple pages. They integrate several themes. Okay, it can be rich. You can have websites which are even hundreds of pages, right? And they require more careful planning and designing, because you have to look at, there are multiple considerations when you are, you know, looking at creation of website, particularly for an e-commerce, e-commerce website, or a website through which you are going to do the selling and buying or activities related to your business activity. So this is a basic understanding, right? Next, you know, when you're talking about e-commerce, softwares and hardwares, so you require a multiple number of hardwares, right, and softwares which are used in setting up the infrastructure, right? So you taking it back, we were talking about the second phase of e-commerce business launching, where we were talking about infrastructure and the resource acquirement, right? So here we are now talking about, first we've discussed how the website is prepared. Now we are talking about the other types of software, right? So so we've already talked about the web server and how the web server is configured and how you take the web server and what hosting and all means. The next type of server that we talk about is the application server, right? Now what is the application server? When you talk about any kind of, activity which is happening on the net or through the website, so there is some amount of calculation or some amount of programming which is required, right? Say for instance, people have done the shopping, they have added the items to the cart. So there has to be a program at the back end which is doing or allowing the user to take in these steps of adding to the cart. So as items are added, the number of items in the cart automatically gets updated. So if you reflect upon it, you understand that yes, there is some amount of programming which is required, right? When the totals are calculated, when discounts are calculated, there is so much of processing which the computer needs to do. How does it do this? It is done through the application programs which are written to do this kind of processing, and these application programs are hosted on the web server or sometimes on a different server which is known as an application server. So the application server will host those programs which are required for processing the different aspects of the website or the online transaction which is happening. Then you have the transaction server, which is basically pertaining to any changes which are happening. It just does not just mean the financial transactions which are happening through the e-commerce website, but any kind of other transactions also, which is keeping a log of how many people came in, how many customers bought, how many were repeat customers. All this information you get from a transaction server. Of course, you get the payment related transactions also, but then this type of also. Then you have a database server. So database server is going to store the complete database of your e-commerce website. And then you need very high-end computing systems. As I already told you that your web servers or all these servers, these are high-end computing systems. They have got enormous processing speed. They have got a large storage area using which they do this kind of processing. And you have a proxy server. Proxy server is basically a server which is used when you have an internet connectivity, when you try to connect your web server and a client. Then another very important aspect of any e-commerce based website is the security aspect. So there are three types of securities which an e-commerce website has to look at. First is the document level security. Okay, then you talk about the customer data security, which we also term as the privacy or confidentiality or anonymity. And then you also talk about the system security, that is your systems should be secure from any kind of malware or any kind of attack. So we will look at all these different aspects of security and how these security mechanisms are implemented in case of e-commerce websites. Right. Then of course you have the middleware, right. So middleware, the name itself means that it stands in the middle, or it tries to bridge the gap between separate, complex and already existing programs. So you have some, we've already seen that you have some application programs, you have databases, you have other kinds of program, you have transactions which are happening. So these are all different programs, and to bring them all together you need some middleware, right. So middleware are specific types of programs which are going to create a uniform interface which will act between these. So middleware actually lies between the operating system and the application programs, right. So application programs are running, and how the operating system is going to interact with the application program is determined by the middleware. So middleware which is used in businesses, there are different types of middleware which are used. So you have middleware for communication, that is emails, collaborations. Then you have middleware which is used for systems and network administrations. Then security solutions, you have particular middlewares. You have middleware which look at the payment solutions, and of course the ones like DBMS which we have already discussed, right. So the first type of middleware that we look at is the communication and collaboration related middleware. So communication on e-commerce websites or on any business activity, business ventures these days, it primarily happens over email, right. So email there could be three types of email services. Like first is the local email, which is also known as proprietary email. Many of the business companies, they have a local email server, and the employees of the company can communicate with this using the local network. So this is not available on the internet, it is something very personal, very private to that institution, right? You cannot send an email through this local email from using the internet. It only works within the organization, within the organization's network. Then you have the online service portals, which provides a wide range of services, like you have the MSN portal, right? So they will provide you weather information, they will provide you news, they will provide you feeds, they will provide you multiple informations. Along with that, they also provide you the email services. So these are much richer. And then you have the web based email, which is the common email that we use. So web based email of course is good because you can access it over the internet, you can access it from anywhere. Like for this online service portal email, you sometimes need a client, you sometimes need a resident client like an Outlook Express or something to configure that email. But in web based email that is not the case. You don't have to, you don't need to have that kind of client. But then there is a disadvantage also here that it has got limited space. Sometimes it is too dependent on the bandwidth, so you cannot access it if the internet connection is not good. So there are pros and cons of different types of communication softwares which we see. So we have discussed in today's lecture, we have discussed about the different types of hardware and softwares that we are using in case of e-commerce portal. We will be continuing on middleware in the following lectures. Till then, please take care of yourselves. Keep watching. Thank you.